So welcome everybody and welcome to our second seminar of the CSR blog end of year seminar series 2020. It's organized by the Corporate Social Responsibility and Business Ethics blog team in partnership with the Center for Financial and Corporate Integrity of Coventry University, directed by Professor Panagiotis Andrikopoulos, and the EU-funded research project Virtue, which aims at unveiling interconnections between tax crimes and corruption. This is the second seminar of a series of 6 fascinating meetings, and today we have the honor to have as a terrific guest, Mary Inman. Before the beginning of the seminar, please allow me to thank the co-organizers of this series, Dr. Don Carpenter from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who will be our moderator today, and Dr. Luca D'Ambrosio from Sciences Po in Paris. On a more personal note, I would like to underline my sincere gratitude for participating in this event. She's the person that with her vast knowledge, contagious passion, and boundless energy has become the source of my inspiration for my research activities in the area of whistleblowing. Thank you very much for being with us here today, Mary. I will now give the floor to Dawn for the seminar introduction and moderation.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I have the distinct honor to introduce an esteemed professional colleague and friend and soon-to-be guest on my podcast, What Does It Profit in November. So I'm very excited about our conversation today with Mary Inman. Mary is a partner in Constantine Cannon's London office, and after 20 years representing whistleblowers in the US, she moved to London in 2017 to launch the firm's international whistleblower practice. She specializes in representing whistleblowers worldwide under the American Reward Program, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Her efforts on behalf of British whistleblower Andrew Patrick were featured in a recent New York Times article, and her successful representation of 3 whistleblowers exposing fraud in the Medicare Advantage program was featured in a recent New Yorker magazine article. Mary, I want your publicist. Mary is a recognized expert and frequent author and speaker on areas related to the application of the American whistleblower laws internationally and the use of whistleblower laws worldwide. So we have an expert with us. Mary, thank you for joining us, and I will turn the floor over to you for a presentation, and then it will be followed up with questions from the panel to get us started, and then the audience is welcome then to join us in questioning. If you, the audience, have questions as Mary goes along, please put them in the chat box and we'll make sure that we address them in the question and answer period. Mary, welcome.
Well, thank you for those marvelous introductions. I'm honored to be here, and Costa, you are as much an inspiration to me and have been so welcoming in my move across the pond. So it's been one of the big delights of being in London, is getting to meet you and your folks at Coventry, and then of course Dawn, it's been a delight. I really enjoyed our time on the What Does It Profit podcast. Looking forward to listening to a bunch of your other guests as well. So I'm going to do a really quick whistle-stop tour to explain to folks what may be new to some people, which is that the United States and now Canada and maybe a few other countries are starting to look at whistleblowing a little bit differently, which is that I think the prevailing view in certainly Europe is that whistleblowers are provided protection in the form of retaliation, cases for retaliation if they've been blacklisted or harmed as a result of their speaking out, but they don't have what I think is unique to the American program, which is that we do more than just protect them after the fact. We want to encourage the whistleblowers who are speaking out to actually get to the agencies and be given access to the prosecutors who can actually act on their information. And in order to do that, we encourage people by paying a reward, typically 10 to 30% of any fine or penalty that the SEC imposes. They share that amount, 10 to 30% of that amount, with the whistleblower. So to me, it's a different construct than I think what a lot of people in Europe are used to. It is catching some momentum. We're seeing Canada, and then I'll talk a little bit more about South Korea and some other big countries that are following suit. But mostly I want to start today just by giving you a quick overview of what the programs look like in the US, then move quickly to the international programs that are comparable, and then most importantly, turn over questions, because the idea of paying whistleblowers for information is something that is seen as quite controversial, and so I'm sure there will be lots of questions and I'm happy to answer them. So I will share my screen, hopefully. Let's see. Here we go. Can folks see the slideshow? Can you see it? Yes, yes, thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah. We see it? Okay. So I'm going to do a quick discussion of the American programs. So I think there's a misconception when you talk about whistleblowing, particularly in the United States, and you think about rewards. I think most people think that they think about Snowden and national security whistleblowers. And I want to be clear that in the United States, we do not provide rewards to national security whistleblowers who are actually trying to expose fraud by the American government. We only pay rewards when it's actually helping the government recoup money, when the government has been the victim. So the whistleblowing programs are incredibly effective. And in fact, that's why we've seen an expansion of them both in the United States and internationally. So the Department of Justice has a program that has been around since the Civil War. It's a statute called the False Claims Act. And it has encouraged whistleblowers not just to bring information to the US government, but to actually launch a lawsuit in the government's name. And so when you talk to the prosecutors, the act was reinvigorated in 1986. And from 1986 until 2019, over $60 billion have been recovered by the US Treasury as a result of the False Claims Act, mostly 85% of that coming from whistleblowers. So when you talk to the prosecutors who receive this information, who get these lawsuits launched by whistleblowers, they will tell you that it is whistleblowers are their #1 enforcement tool. And of course, that's instinctual, right? Because if you're a busy prosecutor and you have tons of files on your desk, the one you're going to pick up first is the one that gives you the roadmap to the fraud, right? You can, government auditors and investigators can audit from the outside all day long. But when you are faced with an insider who can basically spell it all out for you, that is something that's enormously effective and can help the government to prosecute and sort of almost short circuit what can often be the lengthy process. It's sort of as some whistleblower attorneys in the SEC and CFTC office have described whistleblower complaints or whistleblower tips as sort of cake in a box, that the prosecutors just need to add water because everything's been sort of presented for them. So when I say whistleblowing works, I mean, I'm hearing it from the mouths of the people who are the prosecutors who receive this information, who work with whistleblowers. As I mentioned, it's actually was $60 billion now from 2019. So when you switch over to the SEC program, so I should tell a little bit about those programs. Because as a result of the success of the False Claims Act and those numbers that we're telling you that's so staggering, a bunch of agencies in the United States said, hey, we want to get in on the act. Like, we should also welcome whistleblowers because it could be really helpful. So instead of allowing them to file lawsuits in their name, the SEC, the IRS, the CFTC, and now the Department of Transportation all welcome whistleblowers to file what's called a TCR, typically a tip, complaint, or referral. So basically bring a tip to these agencies and then help them to be able to impose penalties or, basically engage their mission. So if it's the SEC, it's protecting investors from securities frauds, accounting frauds, things like that. And so they have, as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act and basically the 2008 financial crisis, the SEC was inspired to adopt its own whistleblower program. And it was inspired by a gentleman by the name of Harry Markopolos, who had come to the SEC's office. He has a small financial investment firm in Boston, and he, in the course of advising his clients about Madoff offerings, he basically determined that they were, it was a Ponzi scheme. So he went 3 times to the Boston office in the SEC and was ignored. So what happened was that when Dodd-Frank was enacted, they created an office of the whistleblower so that it was clear that that would never happen again, that if someone had information, it would be welcomed. There's a special form to fill out. You give it to the office of the whistleblower, and they in turn will give it to the enforcement section who will act on it, and you get to be interviewed and you kind of get to help the investigation. But those have been enormously successful programs of their own. So the SEC program, these numbers are a little bit out of date because we now have new legislation. Basically, there was rulemaking that was going on. The SEC just had hearings where it used to be that they almost had a small number of whistleblower rewards, even though they were huge rewards compared to the number of tips they get. They get something now like almost 6,000 tips a year. They've experienced a 30% increase as a result of COVID. So the program has been enormously successful. But what we've seen in the past, we've seen almost a breaking of the logjam in the past 4 months in terms of the number of awards that have been issued by the SEC. And that is because they made a change in their rules, which says that for cases that I think are under $8 million award to the whistleblower, they will just automatically give the whistleblower the 30%, the top of the range, instead of trying to decide where to put them in the 10 to 30% range, just as a way to free up time so that the SEC isn't spending too much of its time just dealing with how do we determine how much a whistleblower should receive. So these numbers, this used to be, the biggest award used to be $78 million total. It was just eclipsed last week. A gentleman by the name of Edward Siddell. And he, again, is more of what we're seeing as these whistleblower outsiders. He actually wasn't an insider at JP Morgan. He instead is an investment advisor at, has his own pension fund that he advises pension funds. And so he, again, he discerned this fraud where JP Morgan was basically had a conflict of interest where it was referring its clients, its wealthiest clients, to JP Morgan proprietary offerings when they should have been giving them more of an option. So I think part of the success of the SEC program has been the fact that the SEC goes above and beyond to protect whistleblowers. So not only do they receive the information, but they have been very active in finding companies who, in their severance agreements with employees, try to basically gag the whistleblowers and say that they aren't to, that they in exchange for them getting a severance package, that they're not to talk anymore. And so the SEC has fined 9 companies. The biggest one, I think the recent one in 2017, for including language in their severance agreements that silences whistleblowers. Interesting research on whistleblowing. There is a study that basically said when a whistleblower is involved in a government investigation, the financial penalties are likely to be higher. They pay far higher penalties, and there's a much increased likelihood of criminal sanctions. So I've told you a little bit about the SEC program. The IRS program is very similar to the SEC program. It basically welcomes people who have information, who can give a tip about people violating US tax laws, evading their tax obligations, and they similarly pay a reward. And then recently, down here on the DOT, about 3 years ago, the Department of Transportation was so impressed by the success that both the IRS, SEC, and CFTC programs were having that they created their own. The idea was that if you work for a car manufacturer or parts supplier, and you know that the parts or the car has a defect and that it could impact people's safety, then you can bring that information to the DOT, the hope being that the information could get there faster and prevent fatalities. So I think it's just interesting that we've seen an expansion in the American programs itself, which started with the False Claims Act and now have all these agency programs. And I'm now quickly going to jump to, well, actually I should back up. The success of the False Claims Act, when I was telling you about the Federal False Claims Act, that basically involves if the government is being cheated. So if you are a doctor and you're submitting false claims to our Medicare program, if you are a federal contractor and you're supplying supposed bulletproof vests to the American military and in fact they're defective, those are the kinds of cases that a whistleblower can launch on the government's behalf and help to basically protect the fisc from fraud. So that program had been so successful that I think it's now up to 30 states have adopted their own false claims acts, so that if you are defrauding the state of California, we've had a number of cases involving public works projects where you're supplying pipe to the municipalities who supply water to your homes. If those are defective pipes, then you can bring a whistleblower lawsuit in the name of the state of the California and even the localities and help them. So the idea, you're getting the sense what I'm trying to explain is that the United States has expanded and expanded and expanded its laws to allow whistleblowers to come forward and basically be the key that helps them to unlock their prosecutions. So I think I'll just jump really, really quickly to tell you a little bit about the expansion of these programs internationally. So I think certainly the SEC program has gotten a lot of attention. And so it has spawned or created a number of laws. A number of countries have considered adopting similar programs for their securities regulators. The only one so Australia came really close, but they didn't adopt it. But in Canada, the Ontario Securities Commission about 4 years ago adopted basically a similar program to the SEC's. They've actually, since it's been adopted, they've paid out over $8.5 million in rewards to whistleblowers. The only thing that is different in this program, which is something that I think we can talk about in the question and answer section, is that the Ontario Securities Commission caps the amount that a whistleblower can receive at $5 million. So that's very different than when you're seeing the size of the awards that someone like Ted Siddell received, up to $78 million between the CFTC and the SEC. I think that is an interesting thing we could explore in the question and answer about cultural sensitivities to the amounts that whistleblowers can receive. There are programs in Africa and Asia. We were looking at Australia, and we are in the UK. We do have legislation currently pending, but bills by Philippa Whitford and another bill proposed by Baroness Kramer, which are trying to introduce the idea of empowering whistleblowers into the legislation. The Public Interest Disclosure Act in the UK at the moment is over 20 years old, no longer fit for purpose. And so there's a real movement afoot in the UK to amend their whistleblowing laws and actually expand them. There's certainly a consideration of paying rewards that isn't quite there yet, but I think the most novel piece of their legislation is the creation of an Office of the Whistleblower within the UK government. So I think that's it. I think, oh, I didn't talk about South Korea. So the other big country that has an IRS equivalent, so the National Tax Service in Korea has 3 whistleblower reward programs. And one of them has existed for 50 years. So they even predate our IRS program. They've been very successful. And they do the exact same thing, which is they pay whistleblowers for bringing information about tax violations. So I would think that those are sort of the bright spots on where we're seeing the payment of rewards. We also see in Europe when it's a under the competitions and markets authorities in the UK and in Hungary and Slovakia, they all will pay a whistleblower a fixed amount. It's usually around £100,000 if you can give information about collusion and bid rigging. I find this one particularly interesting because I think it's impossible to detect a cartel without having an insider. So I think that even in the UK and in parts of Europe where they have been sort of very resistant to paying awards, the one place that they do is in the competition space. So that was sort of my whistle-stop tour, telling you where it's expanded within the United States and then even abroad. So I'm happy to sort of turn it over for more questions.
Well, Mary, I think we'll start with a few questions from the panel, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay. You mentioned this issue of cultural sensitivity given in different places around the world. Can you talk a little bit about where, what you mean by this, the context, and maybe some examples?
Sure. So since moving to the UK 3 years ago, the minute I talk about what I do, there's almost, to a British audience, there's almost a visceral reaction that, oh, you Americans, you are mercenary, you have to pay people to do the right thing, whereas we're British and we do it because it's the right thing to do. So that, I think, actually is what that sort of cultural bias by, you know, what Americans are doing and that we're capitalism unchecked, that I think has not allowed them to see the programs for what they are. And I'm pleased to say that when we've had discussions, and I work with this all-party parliamentary group for whistleblowing, when you have discussions with people who are now immersed in the whistleblowing issues, and you explain what the money seeks to do, that the money is there because it's a very difficult thing for a whistleblower to decide to undertake all the risks that are involved with speaking out, that it's nice to consider that there might be a safety net under them in the form of a whistleblower reward, which might actually make it less crazy to do, right? Because when you look at these whistleblower cases, you say, who in their right mind is going to take on Theranos, is going to take on Carillion, is going to take on, you know, all of these, Enron, all of the big names that we know in corruption. And that's what our rewards seek to do, is not, is to basically put a cushion under them, sort of a safety net, to say, okay, if you're going to take the leap, hopefully, you know, we can't guarantee it, but if your information is valuable enough that the government uses it, you can receive a potential reward. So when the Brits talk about it more about unemployment insurance or insurance for lifelong career loss, that's where they get traction and think that it's an interesting idea. So that's been my experience in the UK. Of course, with Canada, they jumped on the idea, but they put a cap on the reward at 5 million Canadian dollars. I think that's an interesting piece because there's a sort of a perception of how much is too much, and that they feel like 5 million is sufficient. We can certainly get into a debate, and I'm happy to continue the discussion. But you know, when you look at a lot of financial services whistleblowers who make six figures anyway, and by taking these acts, they may never work again, I would submit that $5 million Canadian may not be sufficient to basically properly incentivize someone.
And certainly after they pay their legal fees.
Yes. Although the nice part for on the way that we in the United States represent whistleblowers is we do it on a contingency fee or success fee basis, which makes the access to justice, access to counsel a lot less, a much smaller hurdle than I think we see in other countries.
And I'll ask one more question, and then I'll give the floor to my colleagues. But I heard you mention Theranos in your remarks, and I don't know if all of the audience is familiar with that particular case, but when you mentioned it, it jogged a memory of a previous conversation we'd had about the process that whistleblower went through and how he found his way to these government programs and what was at risk for him in the process, and what he had to sacrifice to get to a place where he could learn about that.
Yeah, it's an incredible case study, and I think one that resonates with people of a much younger generation because there's so much press around it, and it was such a spectacular fraud, right? The likes of the people who were defrauded were the board members on their board. Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos had this gold-plated Henry Kissinger, General Mathis, and then Tyler Schultz's grandfather, former Secretary of State George Shultz. So I think it's the spectacular nature of how the people of the sort of caliber of the people and the credentials of the people who were hoodwinked, I think makes it a really incredible story. I think, so Tyler is my client. He is remarkable because I think what most motivated his decision to step forward is to protect his grandfather's name. I think he felt like his grandfather survived Iran-Contra scandals and all sorts of other areas. He was not going to have his reputation besmirched by this. And it became very much a familial duty. But as sort of an epic story in terms of David and Goliath, there were, I think, over 800 employees, if not more, in the location in Silicon Valley. And really, there were only two, Tyler and another woman by the name of Erica Chung, who really got together and spoke out when they started to see that the blood test results that were being sent were actually inaccurate, because I'm trying to think the name of the device that they were saying was going to revolutionize laboratories with only testing a prick of blood was actually not working. And so they doubled down. Instead of admitting that they didn't have the technology, they started just testing it using the regular old equipment. But in the process of doing it, a lot of the test results were inaccurate. And that's what really prompted Erica and Tyler sort of in the fact that people could be harmed in getting false blood test results, that really brought both of them to come forward. So it's a rather remarkable story, but I would say in a corporate governance world, which I know a lot of this is what we're talking about here for corporate social responsibility, is that I think it's strange to think that Elizabeth Holmes would choose to surround herself with a board, none of whom have any science experience. So I think that is one of the big lessons to be drawn, is that obviously if you're going to have a board of directors to advise you, if they're all former military people with no tech experience or science experience, they're not going to be able to play the role that they need to play, which is to be a check on the organization.
Absolutely. Luca, can I send it over to you?
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Mary, for your presentation. I have a question about the cultural differences. The cultural different approaches of whistleblower and warning and reward programs. Sorry. In 2015, the Conseil d'État made a report on whistleblower reform, which was acted in France in 2016 with the Loi Sapin II. And the Conseil d'État raised the question about reward programs, and finally said, no, it's not possible for our system to accept this kind of system. So there was some cultural reasons, that's sure. But the Conseil d'État tried also to point out some inconvenience of the reward programs. And the first was that reward programs could foster illegal practices, illegal blowings. And the second one, that they might threat the credibility of the whistleblower. In your practice, did you find this kind of inconvenience in some cases?
I welcome these questions, and this is so every time one of those whistleblower statutes that I described to you has been adopted, these are the questions and concerns that are raised, because they're logical concerns, right? if you put a carrot out in front of someone, are they going to come forward with false information? So that's one of the boogeyman's that people worry about, which has not come to fruition. So there's a couple of ways to address that. In the US legislation, particularly the False Claims Act, you, if you're bringing information that's malicious, that's ungrounded, you still have, you could be sued for a malicious prosecution type case, but you can also be penalized. So this False Claims Act itself says, if you're bringing unfounded information, you can actually have to incur the cost of not just your own attorneys, but the attorneys that are defending the target against these unscrupulous claims. So that's one way that it's protected, but I would argue there's a much more practical way. Most people don't want to sideline their careers to bring this information forward. This notion that, I mean, people have so much vested in their career and their education that they typically, you know, want to do well in this company. And in fact, a lot of my clients don't even know they're whistleblowers until they're treated like one. So there's sort of this notion that I'm head of audit. It's my job to tell you when we're having problems and when there's something that's going to maybe negatively impact the next earnings report. But if you don't like that answer and you want me to bury it, then all of a sudden I'm a whistleblower. So I would say that it's very rare that you have these sort of concern of serial whistleblowers who are bringing information that's just not going to last, that's not going to hold up. But also remember, there's a vetting process. At least in the False Claims Act, those whistleblowers have to get lawyers to bring a case, right? And we have ethical obligations under Rule 11 in the United States and other areas where we can't bring frivolous cases, nor would it help our reputation if we did. So I think it's much less of a concern. I'd say you can legislate around it, right? You can put penalties in place. You can require that they have to have a lawyer so that there's an internal screening going on, other things. So I think that's probably what we've just not seen it come to fruition. Most cases are righteous ones. Most whistleblowers are bringing the information forward. But look, what you're saying, there's a crystallization of it in the Ukraine whistleblower that went after, that served the basis for the impeachment hearings for President Trump. Remember, he was fully corroborated. 8 separate witnesses corroborated him. The New York Times did an op-ed that said, Mr. or Ms. Whistleblower, we believe you. You've been corroborated. But remember, President Trump and the Republicans still doubled down, certain Republican congresspeople, to figure out who that whistleblower was, right? When it's irrelevant, right? If he's been independently corroborated, why do we need to know? But there is this sort of inherent curiosity. We see it with Jess Staley in the UK, right? There's a big case where the former CEO of Barclays Bank, right? He has a whistleblow happen that basically accused one of his hires, one of his old, of cronyism. And his response, this is just after the senior manager certification regime is adopted, his response, instead of preserving the anonymity, which is required, is to double down, get the US Postal Service to look at the postage stamp to figure out who this is. So I think there's just something really unnerving for people about whistleblowers, and that even my view is that I don't care about their motive. And in fact, under the United States False Claims Act, during the Civil War, the concept was it takes a rogue to catch a rogue. So you don't have to come with clean hands. And I think we want everyone to have clean hands. You can't be the architect of the fraud. You cannot have created the fraud and then to benefit from it. But as long as you can point upwards to someone who created it, even if you're aiding and abetting, that's still valuable information. So one of my favorite stories is whistleblower Britney Kaiser. I do a fair amount of speaking with her. She is totally vilified because they think she was doing it as an opportunist. Like she exposed the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal that we all know about. That's even topical today with our 2020 election. But she is totally, people are always criticizing her because they see her as an opportunist. I think it's what her motives were are irrelevant, in my view, as long as she's corroborated.
Thank you. So, I mean, yeah, that's what confirms that behind these mainstream arguments, there are cultural concerns. Thank you so much.
And Costa, I'll send it to you.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Mary. And on the same path, I think I would like you to expand about this. I mean, we are facing the strong reluctance in the EU to adopt this whistleblowing rewarding system. And but in the United States, as you said, it has not been established magically, but as a response to these scandals, Bernie Madoff, the financial crisis, and so on. But also in the US, there was, I think, a certain level of reluctance. And also more recently, it seems that the Trump administration has tried to thwart in a way the program. I would like you to expand on this because this can be a good lesson, I think, for the EU countries that are evaluating us to establish this kind of programs. And in particular, in terms of CSR, based on your experience, I would like to know what do you think is the common corporate response to the establishment of these programs, and what are the counter interests to these programs, and if there is, to your mind, an undue corporate influence in terms of lobbying to remove these programs or to stop them to be adopted, because this, I think, is very important in terms of corporate irresponsible behaviors in this area.
I think you have 3 questions there, Costa. So
Sorry.
You're challenging me. Let me start with the first in terms of the Trump administration. What I'm happy to say is even with the Trump administration and, you know, some very questionable decisions by his Attorney General Barr, even with the Trump administration, we have seen the SEC program level issue some of the biggest fines in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act space, a space where you would expect the Trump team to be really not, that's certainly their vulnerability. So I'm pleased to say that there remains sort of a level of professionalism with the line attorneys in the SEC Enforcement Division, and even with the SEC commissioners themselves, where they just had these recent hearings where they do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, where they have one of the world's most successful whistleblower reward programs. So even for the Trump administration, right, what is Trump's big rallying cry? It's nationalism, and he wants so we have seen a rise in the number of Buy America cases. So if someone is violating our Buy America statutes and are basically making component parts and making things overseas and bringing it in and then claiming it's Buy American, then those are the kind of cases that he loves, right? You can always find a type of fraud that a particular administration likes. So my point is that while I'm sure we know that Trump is certainly the most hostile president we've ever seen to whistleblowers, just because of the number of whistleblowers that have been White House whistleblowers exposing problems with his White House, we still are seeing that the laws are intact and that the line attorneys in Department of Justice, SEC, CFTC, IRS are still doing their jobs. So I think that's a little bit, that's certainly reassuring. I don't want to let Barack Obama off the hook. He was not supportive of national security whistleblowers. So I think even though on the private fraud cases, the types of cases we bring against private contractors, he was very strong. I think he does have a bit of a black eye in terms of how he dealt with national security whistleblowers. So that's my view on the Trump administration. I think your next question dealt with CSR. Reframe the CSR question for me.
So basically the corporate response to the establishment of this program, if there is an undue influence in terms of lobbying to avoid these programs to be established, what do you think?
The Chamber of Commerce in the United States, every time another state, remember I showed you about 30 states in the US that have false claims acts. Right now in Pennsylvania and I think West Virginia and a number of states that don't have it, there's legislation being brought forth currently to adopt these laws. And the Chamber of Commerce is the first to come in and say that the sky is falling. And that obviously represents in the United States the business interests. So I think there's a real concern on the part of business to empowering these whistleblowers to step outside the internal reporting mechanisms and go externally. My response to that would be what we've seen, and why I love speaking to people like Dawn and you on the ethics side of business ethics, is that I think there's this fear that whistleblowers, once there's a reward, they're going to step outside their internal mechanisms and go straight to the government. And that's just not what we've seen. 85% of the whistleblowers that report to the SEC report internally first. And that is consistent with what I was saying to Luca, is that people don't want to lose their jobs, right? They're trying to they want the company to fix it and they want to move on. And they don't want this to be turned into a life-changing event for them, which unfortunately it becomes. So what I think is so interesting, and what we're trying to do culturally with the idea of whistleblowers, is to say to companies, and we're starting to see with the compliance and ethics officers, a real view towards them making the change, saying whistleblowers are a CEO's best friend. Whistleblowers are forward indicators of risk. They are the canaries in the coal mine. Why are you seem to have an autoimmune response, companies, to whistleblowers, that you just have to get them out because they're not yes men or yes women, when instead what they're doing is helping you see things in time for them to correct them. So we're hoping that the sort of Chamber of Commerce view becomes less of the prevailing view and more of a change in a culture about who whistleblowers are within your corporation. And the last thing I would say, because Don and you both know I love to crow about this research, is that professors Kyle Welch at GWU and Stephen Stubens at Utah basically have taken the NAVEX global data. So they have the database where they are the #1 internal reporting mechanism for the Fortune 500 companies. And they basically shown that companies that have active reporting systems are more profitable, have fewer lawsuits, have fewer federal investigations, and those lawsuits they do have settle for less because of this phenomenon that I'm describing. They basically have corroborated what I've always known instinctually, which is whistleblowers are good for business. They're good for your bottom line.
Thank you very
And
much.
I think that's the new hashtag for your campaign.
Yeah, it's been great research for us to crow about.
Well, this may be the time, unless the panel has anything else we'd like to address to Mary, this might be the time to turn it over to the audience. I have 5 questions in the queue. So Costa, Luca, are we ready?
Yes, let me just stop the recording right now. So thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Luca and Dawn. And let's go on with the question and answer time.